Guthrie missing day 60. This, as we learned, the FBI tonight trying to reverse engineer what could be two legitimate ransom notes. This amid reports that Mrs. Guthrie's home was found immaculate when her daughter Annie came rushing in. What, if anything, does that mean to CSI, crime scene investigators? Trust me, it means a lot. And tonight, did a dog named Jolene foil the kidnappers' original plan? Good evening. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Crime Stories. I want to thank you for being with us.
Day 60. That's how long it had been since Savannah Guthrie's mother vanished without a trace, and what started as a quiet missing person report had now turned into something far darker. It began on what should have been a normal evening. Savannah's mother, a routine-driven woman known by neighbors for her consistency, never missed her nightly calls or morning walks. But that day her phone went straight to voicemail. Her house was found unlocked, lights still on, no signs of struggle, but also no sign of her. At first, investigators treated it as a standard missing person case. Maybe she left voluntarily, maybe she needed space, but by day 3, that theory collapsed. Her car was still in the driveway. Her phone, wallet, and keys left behind. That's when things started to feel off. By day 10, the media picked it up. By day 20, national attention followed. And by day 60, investigators were no longer asking where she went. They were asking what really happened inside that house. Detectives began re-examining the timeline. Security cameras in the neighborhood revealed something chilling: a vehicle slowly passing her home multiple times the night she disappeared. Not a neighbor, not familiar. And then came the first major red flag. A close contact, someone who had been in her life more than people realized, had inconsistencies in their story. Small details at first, but like cracks in glass, they spread the more pressure investigators applied. This case was no longer about a missing woman. It was beginning to look like something planned. Something intentional. And possibly something very close to home. Day 60 marked a turning point. Because what investigators were about to uncover next would shift this case from mystery to something much more disturbing. Like and subscribe to Midnight Casebook for more deep, gripping investigations you won't hear anywhere else. By day 60, investigators had stopped looking at the case as a disappearance and started treating it like a controlled timeline waiting to crack. The first breakthrough came from digital forensics. Savannah's mother's phone hadn't just gone silent, it had stopped abruptly. Data analysts confirmed her last activity occurred at exactly 8:42 p.m. the night she vanished. No movement, no signal drift, no attempts to reconnect. It was as if the phone, and possibly her, had been intentionally disabled. Then came the door camera across the street. At first glance, nothing unusual, but when investigators enhanced the footage, they noticed something precise. The same vehicle seen circling earlier had stopped just out of frame for nearly 7 minutes, long enough for someone to approach unnoticed, long enough for something to happen. And then, a second crack in the timeline. A key individual, someone close enough to have access, but distant enough to avoid suspicion, claimed they hadn't left their home that evening, but cell tower data told a different story. Their phone had pinged near Savannah's mother's neighborhood at 8:36 p.m., just minutes before the last recorded activity. When confronted, the explanation changed. First, it was a quick drive. Then, I don't remember exactly. Then silence. Investigators didn't need a confession yet. They had something more powerful: contradiction. Search teams were redirected, not randomly but strategically, based on movement patterns, time gaps, and behavioral analysis. Areas within a 15-minute radius became priority zones. Because if this wasn't a random act, then it was calculated. And calculated actions leave patterns. Day 60 wasn't just about how long she'd been missing. It was about how long someone had been hiding the truth. And that truth was getting dangerously close to the surface. Like and subscribe to Midnight Casebook for more deep, gripping investigations you won't hear anywhere else. By day 61, the investigation took a turn no one could ignore. Search teams had been working a narrowed grid, an area mapped using vehicle movement, phone pings, and behavioral profiling. It wasn't random anymore. Every location being searched had a reason behind it. And then they found something. It wasn't a body. It was a trace. Deep within a lightly wooded area just outside the main road, less than 12 minutes from Savannah's mother's home, investigators discovered disturbed soil. Not obvious to the untrained eye, but clear enough for forensic teams to take over immediately. Nearby there were fragments. Fabric. A personal item. Something that matched what Savannah's mother was last seen wearing. That's when the case shifted again. This was no longer a disappearance. It was now a suspected crime scene. Forensic teams worked through the night, carefully documenting every inch. Ground-penetrating tools were brought in. Cadaver dogs signaled interest in multiple spots, but one area in particular triggered a sustained alert. And then came the confirmation investigators had been bracing for. Biological evidence. Preliminary tests indicated a match consistent with Savannah's mother. It wasn't just evidence anymore, it was a connection. Back at the station, pressure mounted. The person whose timeline had already begun to collapse was brought in again. This time, investigators didn't ask broad questions, they presented facts. The vehicle. The phone pings. The location. The evidence. Piece by piece, the narrative they had been holding onto started to fall apart. And for the first time since day one, silence in the room meant something different. Not confusion. Not denial. But realization. Because what investigators had found in that wooded area didn't just point to what happened. It pointed to who knew exactly where to look. Like and subscribe to Midnight Casebook for more deep, gripping investigations you won't hear anywhere else. Day 62. What had been a slow, methodical investigation was now accelerating, fast. The individual at the center of the contradictions was brought back in, but this time the tone had changed. There were no open-ended questions, no room for vague answers. Investigators laid everything out with precision. The timeline, the phone data, the vehicle movement, the evidence recovered in the wooded area. And then they waited. At first, the response was the same, deflection. I already told you everything. You're twisting it. But pressure in an interrogation room doesn't come from volume, it comes from certainty, and the investigators had it. They introduced something new. Forensic analysis from the home. It turned out that what looked like a clean, undisturbed space had been anything but. Using luminol testing, investigators revealed faint traces, patterns invisible to the naked eye, patterns that suggested something had been cleaned, not thoroughly, just enough to delay discovery. And it worked for a while. But not anymore. The room grew quiet. Then came the shift. The individual's posture changed. Their tone dropped, words became slower, more careful. Not a confession, but not the same denial either. Investigators leaned in, not physically, but strategically. They presented a simple reality. This isn't about if something happened, we already know that. This is about how it happened. Silence. Longer this time. Then came a statement that changed everything. I didn't mean for it to go that far. It wasn't a full admission, but it was enough. Enough to move forward. Enough to secure warrants. Enough to bring this case to its breaking point. Outside, the world was still catching up to day 60. But inside that room, by day 62, the truth had already started to surface. And once it starts, it doesn't stop. Day 63. By now, the case had crossed a line. There was no going back to theories or assumptions. Investigators were no longer building a case. They were confirming it. Following the partial admission, search warrants were executed immediately. The suspect's residence, vehicle, and digital devices were all seized for deeper forensic analysis. What investigators found only tightened the timeline they had been constructing piece by piece. Inside the vehicle, traces were recovered. Not visible, not obvious, but present. Forensic teams identified biological material in areas that had clearly been cleaned, mirroring the same patterns found inside Savannah's mother's home. It was consistent, controlled, intentional. Then came the digital evidence. Deleted messages. Location history fragments. Gaps in activity that aligned almost perfectly with the critical window between 8:30 p.m. and 9:15 p.m. on the night she disappeared. But it was one recovered message that stood out. Time-stamped earlier that evening. A conversation that suggested tension, an argument that had escalated beyond what anyone previously knew. Motive was beginning to form. Not random, not accidental. Personal. Back in interrogation, investigators presented the full picture. No pressure, no raised voices, just facts, layered, undeniable, complete. This time, the silence didn't last long. The suspect exhaled slowly, then spoke. What followed wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, it was controlled, almost detached. An explanation of events. An argument that turned physical. A moment that went too far. And a decision made in panic to cover it up. Just like that, the mystery that held for over 60 days began to collapse in minutes. But for investigators, one thing remained clear. Confession or not, every detail had to match the evidence. Because the truth is what's said in the room. It's what can be proven outside of it. And this case was far from over. Like and subscribe to Midnight Casebook for more deep, gripping investigations you won't hear anywhere else. Day 65. With the confession on record, investigators moved quickly, but carefully. Every statement given had to align with physical evidence. There was no room for error now. The suspect led authorities back to the wooded area. This time not as a search zone, but as a confirmed scene. Forensic teams resumed excavation under controlled conditions. What had previously been treated as disturbed soil was now approached with precision. Layer by layer, the ground was carefully removed. And then the confirmation came. Human remains. The area fell silent as the recovery process began. Every movement was documented, every detail preserved. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore, it was about ensuring those answers held up in court. Preliminary identification matched Savannah's mother. For the investigators, it closed the question of where. But it opened the final phase of how and why. Back at the station, the suspect's earlier statement was revisited. With the recovery confirmed, inconsistencies became easier to isolate. Small omissions, slight shifts in wording, each one mattered. Because even with a confession, the case had to be airtight. Autopsy results would determine the exact cause of death. Forensic timelines would confirm sequence of events. Digital evidence would reinforce intent and movement. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was now a prosecution. For Savannah, the outcome was something no one prepares for. 65 days of uncertainty ended not with relief, but with reality. Closure doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it just brings truth. And the truth in this case was as direct as it was devastating. A life taken, a story hidden, and a trail of evidence that, piece by piece, refused to stay buried. The case was no longer a mystery. It was now a matter of justice. Day 72. With recovery complete, the investigation entered its most critical phase, turning everything they had uncovered into a case that could stand in court. This was no longer about discovery. It was about precision. Every piece of evidence collected from the home, the vehicle, and the wooded site was now being processed, catalogued, and cross-referenced. Forensic analysts worked to align timelines down to the minute. The goal was simple. No gaps, no doubt. Autopsy results confirmed what investigators had suspected. The cause of death was consistent with a violent altercation, one that escalated quickly but left clear physical indicators. Injuries matched the suspect's partial account, but also revealed something more. This wasn't just a moment that went too far. There were signs of control, of intent after the fact, of a deliberate effort to conceal. That distinction mattered. Because in court, the difference between panic and planning changes everything. Meanwhile, digital forensic teams reconstructed the suspect's movements with increasing clarity. GPS data, app usage, and time-stamped activity logs created a near-complete map of that night. From the moment they arrived, to the time they left, to the route taken afterward. Nothing stood alone anymore, every detail supported another. Even the earlier recovered message, the argument, was now part of a larger narrative. Motive wasn't speculative anymore. It was structured. Prosecutors began preparing charges. Investigators conducted final interviews, ensuring that witness statements aligned with the physical and digital evidence. There was no rush, but there was urgency. Because once this moved to trial, every detail would be challenged. And it had to hold. For Savannah, for her family, and for the case itself, this phase was about one thing: accountability. The truth had been uncovered. Now it had to be proven. Like and subscribe to Midnight Casebook for more deep, gripping investigations you won't hear anywhere else. Day 80. What had been weeks of investigation, recovery, and reconstruction finally reached a defining moment. Formal charges were filed. By this point, the case was no longer built on suspicion or partial admissions. It was anchored in a complete evidentiary framework: forensic analysis, digital tracking, witness statements, and the suspect's own words. Prosecutors moved forward with confidence. The charges reflected the weight of the evidence: homicide, with additional counts tied to concealment and obstruction. Each charge was supported by a clear sequence of events investigators had painstakingly assembled. From the initial argument, to the fatal escalation, to the calculated attempt to erase what happened. Nothing stood alone. Everything connected. In court, the suspect appeared composed, but the shift was undeniable. This was no longer an interview room. There were no more controlled conversations. Every word, every reaction was now part of a public record. The plea not guilty. It wasn't unexpected. Despite the earlier admission, legal strategy often demands a different posture once charges are filed, and for the prosecution, it changed nothing. Because their case didn't rely on a confession. It relied on proof. Outside the courtroom, attention intensified. The story that began as a quiet disappearance had now become a full-scale criminal case. Every detail, from the timeline to the recovery, was being examined, discussed, and questioned. But inside the legal process, focus remained narrow. Facts, evidence, consistency. For Savannah, this phase brought a different kind of weight. The search was over, the answers had been found. But now came the part that would determine everything. Justice. And justice, unlike investigation, doesn't unfold in silence. It happens in full view, where every detail matters and every decision carries consequence. Like and subscribe to Midnight Casebook for more deep, gripping investigations you won't hear anywhere else.